Perception as a relationship. Mother-in-law has always viewed her son's choice of life partner as somehow beneath him. She has persisted in looking upon the younger woman with a critical and unloving eye. At some point, provoked by whatever eventualities, mother-in-law has occasion to rethink her harsh picture of her daughter-in-law. Mother-in-law now comes to be able to see her as the lively and supportive source of happiness in her son's life that she is. I'd like to read this vignette, which some of you will recognize as taken from Iris Murdoch, underdescribed though it is, as exemplifying a certain kind of conflict that each of us may sometimes encounter. The conflict may be ethical, but it is also perceptual. It has to do with finding a way to see what is there, and it has to do with understanding the sources of our difficulty or even our failure to see what we ought to see. The conflict takes the form of an apparent paradox. To see a person and to appreciate their value, you must already look at them, and so already look at them with an open and, so to speak, loving heart, which to say you must already value them. In fact, there is no paradox, and this is because knowing a person, appreciating their qualities, valuing them, is not something we accomplish once and for all. It's more of a work in progress than that. It's a process governed by aspiration, and it is the dedication to this process in which the loving relationship actually consists. So to love someone is to do the work of finding them and keeping them at the focus, among other things. It's a way of actively orienting to them. Just as the dancer actualizes their relationship with their partner in the motivated adjustments of the dancing itself, so the friend or lover enacts the relationship in which friendship consists, in which love consists, in striving to do so. But this very relationship is the achievement of the other, a coming to know them. This makes love and caring epistemic emotions, and it makes perception into an exercise of value and concern. I'll just read that sentence again. This makes love and caring epistemic emotions, and it makes perception into an exercise of value and concern. A theme which, by the way, independently is explored in some recent work by Hannah Dieger. Which brings me to my main theme. As with love and other relationships, so with perception. To perceive is not to register, to detect, or to represent. It is to come to know, to make the situation's acquaintance, to accomplish intimacy. It is never just a relation, it is always a relationship. A comparison may help. I adjust the microscope to secure the focus of the item on the slide that I'm interested in. But those adjustments of the eyepiece are not antecedent to the seeing of the item. They're not, as it were, analogous to wiping the window clear so I can see through it. They are the work, these adjustments, of seeing itself. I actualize my perception of the microbe, say, in these negotiations and adjustments, these exercises of motivated skill and curiosity. And the work of getting and keeping the microbe in view, keeping it in focus, is the relationship of seeing it. And it's also, obviously, the work of caring. Like human relationships more generally, perception is organized by care, concern, and value, not always positive. So, quick, just to check, can people acoustically hear me? Yeah. Consider the proposition that perception is a relation to an object, something like the relation of consciously attending to it. Philosophers of perception will recognize that as a view that's been explored by a number of people, but most especially John Campbell. This can seem like an attractive idea in some ways. It frames perception as out of our heads, in the world, a transaction with things, a psychological accomplishment that is in some sense object dependent or world involving. Such a relational conception, so-called, appeals to some philosophers because it seems to offer a line of defense against the idea that perceptual experiences are states of consciousness whose occurrence is radically world independent, states that could occur in a dream, say, or in the matrix. True, those who adhere to the relational conception concede, it might not always be possible to know whether you're seeing something that is consciously attending to it or merely seeming to see it. But the very coherence of this contrast, that we might not know whether we are in visual contact or merely seem to be, presupposes rather than challenges the distinction between robust world-connected perception on the one hand and mere fantasy or hallucination on the other. Or anyway, that's what the relationist believes. But let us ask, what is meant by an object, as in the phrase conscious attention to an object? We sometimes see things like tomatoes, stags, facades, faces, and these are objects. But what of the other things we see, such as unkind intents, expressions of love, a person's quick understanding, not to mention such things as dark patches against the foliage, after images, glares and gleams, floating bodies in the eye? Are these objects too? They are the sort of thing to which we can pay close visual attention. Anscombe, Elizabeth Anscombe, noticed that there are two competing senses of the word object that are apt to be confused in this context. One is the idea of the concrete thing, physical, a material, hard-bodied, particular, a stag, a pebble, a planet, a champagne flute. But the other is the idea of something rather more like a topic, or perhaps a theme, although this is not the language she used. It's in this sense that we might ask, what's the topic or theme? That is to say, what's the object of your inquiry, of your conversation, of your anxiety? To allow that conversations and inquiries and anxieties have objects in this sense, that is to say topics or themes, which of course they do, is to say nothing at all about their ontological status. In particular, it's certainly not to assume that they're objects in the first sense, like stags or pebbles. For example, the object of my anxiety and the subject of our conversation and the target of our inquiry might very well be, for example, whether there's likely to be a strike or whether my shoes need to be resoled. And so with episodes of visual experience, Anscombe believed, we ask, what do you see? Or what was your visual experience the experience of? But there's no demanding that the only acceptable way of answering such questions is by naming something like a stag or a pebble, an object in the first sense of the term. So then what of this formula that to see is consciously to attend to an object? If Anscombe is right, and I think she is, this really is just wordplay. For either it's simply the acknowledgement that there are objects of sight in the sense in which there are topics of conversation, and these might very well be non-physical, non-existent, mere figments or fantasy. Or it's to notice that, yes, sometimes we see things like pebbles and stags. But Anscombe's true insight, one that she comes very close to articulating, and I think she understood but doesn't really fully articulate, her true insight is that talk of objects and of our conscious attention to them conceals rather than uncovers the messy, unruly diversity and open-endedness of what is seen. Anscombe insisted that seeing for us depends on the unruly diversity. And with this, she comes closer, I think, than any other one of the early pioneers of analytic philosophy. She comes closer, very close, to arriving at the same thought that Merleau-Ponty had hit upon about 20 years earlier, and which he summed up in the phrase, "Nothing is more difficult than knowing precisely what we see. If you say that to a relationist philosopher like John Campbell, their jaw, a dear colleague, by the way, a friend, their jaw will hit the floor. What could be easier than knowing exactly what you see? No, nothing can be harder than knowing that. It is also this precisely labile and unruly quality of perceptual consciousness that gives pause when we turn to the other key notion of the so-called relational conception, which I'm now briefly considering, namely the idea that that relation is one of conscious attending. Is my perceptual awareness limited by what I'm consciously attending to? This is not obviously true. It certainly seems to be the case that we have a sense of the presence of much more than is immediately focal or foregrounded in attention. So here too, actually, we could turn our attention to the varieties of presence. But the biggest challenge faced by the relational conception, or any conception of seeing or any other perceptual modality, as a matter of the mere obtaining of a relation to an object, is that it fails to appreciate just how much we need to do, just how much we do in fact do, how much work is required on the part of the perceiver to secure the would-be relation. If seeing is a relation to an object, then it's one that at best we aspire to, and that sometimes, maybe even always, we never fully realize or secure. A poor analogy, in baseball, batting is not just a matter of putting bat to ball. That's relatively easy. Mere contact is a far cry from getting a hit. And anyway, good batters routinely strike out, that is, fail to hit the ball. What makes them batters is not that they succeed, but that they do the work, they make the adjustments, they adapt themselves to the challenge of knowing the pitcher and the balls the pitcher is throwing. And so with seeing, this is my thought, even in the so-called good cases, when, as we might say, contact with the object is secured, there's no question of hallucination or radical misperception, the perceptual availability of objects is fragile, partial, and unfinished. Let me explain, and here I draw on ideas I've explored in other writing, even in Action and Perception, when I was still a young person back in 2004. When you see something, you only see visible parts of it. And even those bits are frequently occluded by the clutter that makes up our natural habitat. And yet we enjoy a perceptual sense of what there is around us. We're not confined just to the facing sides or the surfaces. We experience the presence even of the hidden portions of the things we see. Indeed, the striking accomplishment of vision is that it supplies us access to that which is present, even though it's hidden or out of view or absent. The phenomenology here is really very distinctive, and it's hard to describe it precisely. But here's an important point. We don't merely think that there is more there that we do not see. We enjoy a sense of the presence, of the visual presence, of the more's presence. Nor is it the case that we take ourselves, as it were, incoherently to see things that we cannot see. Not at all. The back of the object you're looking at, which is out of view, does show up, but it shows up as out of view. We take ourselves to have a visual sense of the presence of things precisely as unseen. Unseen or absent is their modality of presence. So you might think then that we have to view ourselves as saddled with a divide between real presence, the object's front, say, tomato's front, and the presence of that which is absent, that is to say, presence as absence, the back of the tomato. But in fact, it's presence as absence all the way down. No quality, no surface, no facing part is so simple or uniform or overt as to lack hidden parts, qualities, or dimensions. presence as absence is fractal. Zoom in, and there's more presence as absence of the very same variety. To encounter the surface of the tomato, for example, as with the tomato as a whole, is to encounter something whose expanse exceeds what can be taken in entirely in a glance. Seeing is always seeing more. That's why I think seeing, or perception in general, is always the exercise of the imagination. Even something so overt, so manifest, so visible as color has hidden structure and body. This red that I can see now looks the way it does here now in this light, but it would look different in other lighting conditions, or depending on the chromatic qualities of the surround, or depending on changes in our viewing angle. So the real color only unleashes itself through activation and exploration. The real color is like the shape of an object you see from an angle. You can't see it all from here, but it is all here for you. It shows up. You see because you understand, usually in a bodily sensory motor way, what it will do, how it will unfold, what it will disclose as conditions change. So in fact, the opposition between real presence and presence as absence collapses, and all presence, this has been, like it or not, my central preoccupation in a lot of my work, all presence is just a matter of different styles of skillful, motivated access, different paths of availability. In perception, we do not represent or consume or take in, rather we have access. And there are so many different ways to do this. So my conclusion from these kinds of considerations is that perception is not a relation to an object or to situations or whatever. It's the work of achieving such a relation, which is to say, it's the ongoing and always potentially problematic relationship with the thing or the situation. Perception is an activity of making acquaintance, coming to know, or achieving intimacy with the world around us. To perceive is not so much to be in relation to things, relations that might just happen to obtain. To perceive is to work to achieve relationships with things. What kind of relationships? Relationships of intimacy, which is to say of knowledge. It has been observed that you don't love someone because of their qualities. If you did, then your love would be fickle and inconstant, since qualities change, and lots of people have similar qualities. Rather, you appreciate the qualities of your beloved because you love them. It's the love, your interest in them, your orientation to them, your openness and vulnerability to them, that is to say, your relationship with them, that first puts you in a position to know them, or better, the love is precisely the relationship striving to achieve that knowing of them. Now, not all relationships are loving, but all relationships, at least as I'm thinking about them, are dynamic, polymodal, plural activities of sustaining an orientation to an object or person, and in that sense, sustaining an openness to them. This is no less true of hate than it is true of love. And this is true of the stamp collector's relationship with their stamp collection as it is to a parent's relationship with their child. To love someone or to hate them is to do the work of knowing them. And that work is the expression of concern, either positive or negative. One important thing about relationships is that, and I've already suggested this, they are self-actualizing, or in a way self-concerning or self-referring. Love enables the knowledge of the object, that is the love's target, and finally its justification and motivation. I'll read that sentence again. Love enables the knowledge of the object, that is the love's target, and finally its justification and motivation. But the same is true of any human relationship. This is sometimes obscured, because some of our relationships seem to be attitude independent. Two people can stand in the spouse relationship to each other, or that of parent to offspring, or that of being co-workers, regardless of their attitude to each other. Those are mere relations in my sense. True relationships, in contrast, as I'm thinking of it, are of their very nature attitude dependent. A relationship is an orientation to another or to an object or an institution or an idea. That makes it possible for the other to be truly present. The relationship I have with a person who is my colleague is that in virtue of which they can show up for me the way they do. For example, as someone to whom I can turn, or on whom I can rely, or on whom I can trust in the workplace. The relationship is not something that comes for free just in virtue of the obtaining of a mere relation. It's something we make and accomplish. But relationships are also, and this is the second time I'm using this word, fragile. By this, I do not mean merely that relationships can break down or fail or come to an end. I have in mind rather the fact that the very vulnerability of relationships to change, their liability to alter or to fail, their susceptibility to evolve and to require and demand concern and attention and sustenance is one of their basic features. Compare once again with the case of color. It belongs to the very nature of colors that how they look tends to change as conditions change. To know the color is to know something whose presence is marked by change, fluctuation, usually predictable. But sometimes color constancy breaks down in the jargon of psychology. In those cases, we lose our perceptual relationship to the color. But by and large, a sensitivity to and ability to cope with variation and change is the very stuff of what it is to be in a relationship with the color. Or consider other projects. Just as tripping doesn't interrupt my hike, but is rather a modality of my hiking, one whose very possibility is contained within the hiking project itself. And just as misunderstanding each other doesn't shut down communication between us, but only opens up new avenues for meaning making between us, so in general, relationships sustain themselves in the face of change and vulnerability. You hold a brick and you hold a delicate porcelain pot. It's tempting to say that this is a generic exercise of feeling by touch, holding, yielding knowledge of the different natures of the objects in question. But I think this gets things backwards. The way we hold a delicate porcelain and the way we hold a brick are different. And it is precisely in these different ways we engage our holdings that we achieve their different characters, that we enact these. Porcelain holding and brick holding are not just different applications of one generic holding relation. They're different ways of being in relationship with different things. True, we promiscuously use the hands in both cases, but we project them into the world in totally different ways, corresponding to what we're trying to do, corresponding to the relationship we're trying to inaugurate and sustain. This reminds us that visual consciousness is not like a beam that lands indifferently on jewels and garbage, clouds and friends. Seeing, like touching, is not an all-purpose, one-size-fits-all sort of thing. Plato famously entertained the thought that when we see a fire shoots forth from the eyes that reaches all the way to things. Aristotle mocked that idea, and that's been the general attitude ever since. But despite this, and I think really rather surprisingly, I've recently come to think, the idea that seeing is one thing, something like a visual fire streaming forth from the eyes, is assumed by most extant theories of vision. I sometimes think of it as the Spider-Man view. You shoot forth the web or from the eyes, and what you see is what the web's attached to. They attach to blocks of wood, cactuses, buckets of slop, dirty laundry, not to mention the people you love and care about. The very idea that seeing is one thing, generic and always the same, simply finding different targets, betrays, I think, a kind of neglect. The idea that I'm doing the same thing when I see a black and wet plastic bag stuck against the mesh fence, and when I watch my daughter perform her latest dance moves, is to me about as plausible as the idea that I'm doing the same thing when I make a pot or throw a baseball. I used the throwing pun yesterday, so I chose to abandon. I could have said throw a pot and throw a baseball. Yes, we use the hands to throw a pot and throw a ball, and these are both kinds of throwing, but they correspond to really different universes of our lives. And this sheds light, by the way, on the question of reading. Reading is visual, but it is in no way a mere application of a generic ability to see. But that's how it is with seeing in all its varieties. Seeing is a style of exploration and achievement of relationship with the world. But styles, and this is why the concept is so apt, contain multiplicities of variation. Nor is reading one thing. Reading a novel, reading the instructions on how to give oneself a rapid COVID test, reading the results of such a test, reading a billboard, reading a website, reading a comic book, reading research materials in one's own field, reading over one's inbox and email, reading text messages, reading the back of the cereal box, not to mention reading aloud or reading aloud to one's child or to an academic audience. These are all different, and they all make very different demands and challenges on us. Students, I think, suffer very often because they don't realize that different kinds of reading demand different kinds of activity. The scientific study of perception, and by and large also its philosophical study, have tended to be resistant to this kind of appreciation. They want a formulaic account of seeing is this or touching is that. This comes out, for example, in the idea, the common assumption, that vision is an optical phenomenon, and that what is visible is what projects to the eyes of the perceiver. But we aren't confined in vision to what is visible in this sense. As I've already indicated, we enjoy visual access, and so a sense of the visual presence of so much more than is visible on the optical projective model. Nor do we automatically see everything that is visible in the relevant sense. Change blindness and inattentional blindness famously demonstrate this, but as anyone who's ever tried to find the keys on the counter right in front of you knows, you don't need a demonstration of this. I think that vision is actually no more optical than pottery is tactile, which is, of course, to allow that most people use their hands to pot, people who are potters, and most people use their eyes to see. But this doesn't mean that either the eyes or the hands are necessary. There are disabled potters who don't use their hands to pot, and it's conceivable that there could be forms of prosthetic vision as well. But what is necessary, I think, for real perception, or for real seeing, or for real potting, is that the potter or the perceiver throw themselves into their situations and engage them with concern. Sensory stimulation alone of the hands or of the eyes, even in the normatively perfect body, doesn't achieve anything except maybe an itch, a tickle, or a flash. A second idea, which is really a variation on this first, that tends, I think, to prevent us from appreciating that to see something is to enter into a relationship with it, and that these relationships are plural, is the idea that seeing is really about detecting or registering. This is the heart of empiricism. Sight gives you contact with the thing, and then you can think about it. Then you can evaluate it. Then you can represent it in your fantasy. According to this way of thinking, perceiving is prior to thinking, understanding, valuing. It's a condition of the possibility of the latter. But not really. Yes, you can see a thing and not know what it is. And you can sometimes first pick something out and then later judge it to be a thing of a certain sort. And it is true that when you see something, You can ask about the colors and shapes or outlines of the things you see. But this doesn't imply that you only ever really see shapes and colors, just as the first points don't imply that you only ever see uninterpreted some things. Finally, to hammer my point, seeing and thinking are different ways of entering into relationships with the world around you. So from the standpoint of this relationship view that I'm offering you, your conceptual knowledge, no less than your sensory motor skills and your curiosities and your affective orientations, needn't be thought of as operating consequent on perception, but can be thought of, as with my example of the microscope, as belonging to the negotiations whereby we bring things and situations into focus. Because I know what a TV is, TVs can be there for me in perception. Now I'm coming to the end. It might be objected, mother-in-law did see her daughter-in-law, however pinched and unloving her gaze. To suppose otherwise is to be misled by the fact that we can use the word see narrowly to refer to visual perception, and more generally to something like understanding and appreciation, as when we say things like, I see what you mean. So yes, mother-in-law didn't see her daughter-in-law in the second sense. She didn't get her, but that doesn't mean that she didn't see her in the first sense. That is, to know all about how she looks. There's nothing wrong with mother-in-law's eyes. I've said a good deal already to indicate why I think this objection goes astray. The work of seeing, I believe, even in the thinnest, most purely visual sense, is precisely the work of achieving access to what is there, and so of accomplishing its presence, making it be there. And this depends on care and curiosity, interest, as well as bodily sensory motor, and also conceptual understanding. But in conclusion, I want to address what strikes me as the root worry underlying this objection. And this is the thought that you don't need to care about something to see it. So maybe you can help me figure out good ways to answer this objection. I stumble upon a dead pigeon in the entrance to my building. I'm careful to avoid walking directly under the worker up in the air bucket lift. I wait until the light turns green. I see all these things, pigeon, worker, light, but why say I care about them? Why say I need to enter into a relationship with them in order to see them? Theories of perception tend to nourish themselves on a diet of marveling at the powers of sight. How do we manage to perceive so much given the paltry sensory data actually reaching our nerves? But the more interesting question has always been, why do we see so little when there is so much around us to see? And the answer to this more interesting question, I think, roughly has to do with, we can never manage to see more than we can care about. Not caring disables us. Take the case of reading again. If you are literate, words pop. They are there for you. But if you don't know how to read, words can't even really show up. They can't capture your attention. They can't absorb your interest. You can't care about them. The enemy of relationship is indifference. And so I believe indifference is the chief cause of blindness, which is one reason, by the way, why the visually disabled, people who call themselves and are called blind, are not really blind in this sense. They're not blind in the way that the extremely depressed can be, or the drug addicted. Real blindness is hopeless indifference, resignation without motivation. But before you object that depressed people are not generally visually impaired, recall that they're not totally indifferent either. Now, sometimes the world makes us pay attention. It causes us to orient ourselves to it, much as a dog orients to the squirrel. The worker in their bucket lift, the dead pigeon, the traffic lights have this capacity, not merely to command our notice as would a loud bang or a bright flash, but to captivate us, to hold us. But this liability to be in this way made to take notice and enter into a relationship is tantamount to a kind of concern. Often the world is more quiet. As already noted, we fail to see so much that we have a perfectly good opportunity to see. We fail to see so much that we have a perfectly good opportunity to see. Again, this is really, this humble conclusion, I think, is the chief take-home result of change blindness literature, which for me personally was important in my thinking about it. It was really important for my formation as a philosopher of perception. So to see things, you need more than sensory stimulation. You need to shift into gear and care about them. And I think that, even in a sense, you really need to open your heart for them. There are other reasons why we don't see, why we don't enter into a relationship with what there is. Sometimes we can't. We've already considered the case of the illiterate who's confronted with words, but we are all, in many respects, illiterate, confined as we are by our own habits, limitations, standpoints. And illiteracy helps us delimit the domains that we care about and can be concerned with. So there's a special kind of perceptual predicament where we come face to face with something. Something shows up, but we find it unintelligible. We're not equipped to bring it into focus. I call this the aesthetic predicament because it's a predicament and an opportunity that we historically use art to investigate. Good works of art are typically opportunities to move from not seeing to seeing, or from seeing to seeing differently. Such works are opportunities for the perceiver to reorganize and remake themselves so that they can give a damn. But the predicament is not confined to the art setting. Sometimes, in order to know the thing in front of you, you need to do a lot of personal work. And I think that's what's going on in the vignette from Iris Murdoch, with which I began. Mother-in-law needs to change herself so that she may know the person she is with. And this is what goes on, I think, when we encounter the racial or sexual or political other. We need to reorganize ourselves ethically, sexually, politically, but also conceptually, just to appreciate who this person is or what they are. You can think of your own examples. So there's one final thought now before I stop. I'll be just about 40 minutes exactly, leaving about 10 minutes for question and answer. Actually, I don't like the word question and answer, discussion. The final thought is this. We are an aesthetic predicament to ourselves in the sense that I've just explained. And I think this is the really deeper meaning of Anscombe's and Merleau-Ponty's appreciation of just how difficult it is even to say what you see. It's difficult to describe what we see, in part because our relationships are fragile, and also because the very act of description changes what we take ourselves to be describing. When it comes to perception, we aren't dealing with representation, resolution, bandwidth, or other related kinds of computational or optical phenomena. In this sense, perceiving really is more like friendship than it is like photography. And so it shouldn't be surprising that questions about perception have this unruly and labile character, that they are aesthetic. The question, do I really see you, is a bit like the question, it's a different question, but it's like the question, do I really love you? And the question, what do I see really, is a question about my attitude and relation to the whole world, questions that don't have simple answers. And this is perhaps also why the desire to be loved is so closely tied to the desire to be seen. The work of relationships consists in showing up as much as it consists in the work of letting the other, or the object, or the world show up. Thank you.
Alva was very timely, so we have 10 minutes for questions.
So thank you. So this question is, why do we see so little? is a good question. I guess a traditional cognitive science answer is we see so little because our attention is limited. We have limited attentional resources. You want to say that we see so little because we only care about so much. So the question is talking about caring just another way of talking about attention?
Maybe. Why one prefers one word rather than another can have a little bit to do with the local histories of debates connected to certain words. Attention, I think, in one sense of the term, is something that I can offer to something, and in attending to it, let it unflower for me. Let me see it in more diversity than I could see it before. And in that sense of the word attention, I think it's very similar to what I have in mind about caring. In that sense of the word attention, and in my sense of the word caring, caring is very much closely tied to our background, skills, knowledge, capacities in the situation in which we find ourselves, to forms of cultural habit. Often when people use the word attention, they mean something like a computational mechanism for filtering a stream of information processing. And that tends to divorce attention from caring. And in other words, a good theory of attention needs to connect it in the way I am to action.
Thank you very much for your wonderful talk. It's clear from your story that we're not detecting anything when we're perceiving or seeing. And usually in the literature and talk side, the opposite of detecting is projecting. And I have a sense that you don't want to say that we're projecting anything either, but I would like to ask you more about that. And especially just to say a little bit more about the claim you made that seeing is always an exercise of imagination. How do you understand imagination here? I take it that you don't want to say you're projecting things in the world either, but I'm wondering about this idea of love and being in a, say seeing myself, something about maybe connected to mental health. It made me think that with your story, I could try to think about changing my attitude to myself and seeing myself in a better way if I love myself, and that could be something connected to self-help. But then again, are we talking about projecting things or trying to bring about a world we would want with the seeing, or there's yet a different kind of relationship and the role for imagination to play here?
Thank you. There were a lot of questions there, and you've all heard my voice so much. I don't want to spend too much time answering you because I want to hear the other comments. But very briefly, I think that the fundamental thing that goes on in perceiving is the achieving of access to where we are, to who we're with. And the ability to achieve access to the world depends on the world and also on us, what we can do, what we know how to do, what we're equipped with. Can we read? Can we move our heads? Can we move our eyes? Do we have the sensory motor understanding of what happens when we move our eyes? With that equipment or that repertoire of skills, we can make contact. But making contact is never once and for all. It's always ongoing, a work in progress. I just think what I've described is one way of thinking about what the imagination is in a tradition that comes down from Kant, say. But we could talk about, there's so many different uses of the word imagination. But that's why I see perception and imagination as almost coextensive ideas. And then finally, very, very briefly, I want to take the idea that perception is cognitive. I want to do away with it, actually. I want to start thinking of perception as an emotion, an epistemic emotion.
Thanks, thanks, Alva. I'm with you almost all the way, but there are a couple of things where I felt uneasy, and they're connected. One is about the reciprocity of vision, and the other is about what you said about blindness. With the reciprocity of vision, I think that's a concept that was brought in originally by John Berger in his classic work on ways of seeing. The point that where you're looking or regarding another person, you're seeing someone else who is seeing you. You can't see your own face, and your existence as a being is confirmed in the sight of others, because you can see that the person you're talking to is looking at you, and you're very aware of that. So it clearly makes a difference whether the topic of your attention is another being who can see as you can or not. So that's the first thing, that in all ordinary human face-to-face interactions, the reciprocity of seeing is fundamental. The second thing is about blindness, and you probably know the classic account by the theologian John Hull, who went blind in his mid-30s, I think, and he describes the whole experience of it. And one of the most moving parts of it is where he explains about how there comes a point where he can't see other people seeing him, and how that casts a kind of doubt. He says he feels like he's going around with a sack over his head, because and after a while begins to wonder, do I really exist at all? Because no longer is his existence being confirmed in the sight of the faces of others, which he can no longer see. Which made me think that when you say, of course we're all blind to a degree, because we pay attention to so few things, that somebody who actually suffered from seriously impaired vision might be a bit annoyed by that. I remember having the same feeling reading James Elkins has a slightly different argument about vision, where he also says, you know, we're all blind because there are also all these things that we don't pay any attention to. And in his book, anything that does not register as an image, we haven't seen, and therefore we're blind to. I think that's nonsense. But still, the point, he's somehow redefining blindness in such a way that the real experience of visual impairment of a person like John Hull is kind of denied, and that bothers me slightly.
I don't want to deny anything. I think my language was a little bit more porous than you're suggesting, Tim. But it's funny that in past talks, I've often been accused, well, not often, I have, I think, very unfairly sometimes been accused of being ableist, which in the United States is a very bad thing to be. And so here in my talk today, I argued that blind people aren't really blind, and normally sighted people are blind, and I'm still accused of somehow not being fair to the blind. No, actually, I think there's a fundamental difference between the experience of loss and needing to reattune oneself to one's world when one loses the ability to see, and the experience of lifelong congenital blindness. And I had worked very closely with as an artistic collaborator with lifelong congenitally blind people, and they just don't feel cut off from anything. They feel a bit annoyed that the world around them doesn't seem to be built for them, and they have to conform to the standards of people whose ways of getting around are different from theirs. But this feeling of the sack over the head, and this feeling of loss, and this feeling of loss of themselves is just not their concern. And the point about reciprocity, I'd like to think about more. That's important for me to think about. I didn't say this at the beginning, because it might have felt like an apology, but this is very much work in progress, and I'll go back and think about Berger and your comment. Thank you.
Thank you, Alva. I was asked to be very quick with my question. So I enjoyed very much the presentation and the notion of perception as a relationship. So I'm trying to understand a little bit better what you mean by that. I'll give you an example from my work, and I wonder if you can give me an explanation of that in the context of your thinking about perception as a relationship. Very often, with many porters that I work with, they can see things, they can perceive something that is happening in front of me, and I cannot perceive that something. They see things that I cannot see. My explanation, to put it simply, is that I lack the skill necessary to see that something which they have and they can see or experience. if we accept your view of perception as a relationship, am I understanding correctly that I cannot have a relationship with clay at that moment? Thus, I cannot see what they can see because they have that relationship. And if that is indeed the case, I do care and I do struggle for many years to establish this kind of relationship. I do have it in most of the cases. I don't have that ability to see in many others. So I wonder how those distinctions.
Excellent,
play
thank you.
to-
That question goes right to the very spirit of my account, because the kinds of questioning of what exactly is the relationship I bear to the clay, we can interrogate it ourselves, just as we interrogate what exactly is my relationship to her. You know, what exactly is my relationship to him? What exactly is my relationship to my profession? You know, and there aren't simple answers, because we're always beginning and changing and figuring it out. So of course I wouldn't say you have no relationship to the clay at all, but your relationship to the clay is challenging you. And the change that you need to make, and this is an example for me of the aesthetic predicament, the change you need to make is essentially how to move from seeing this clay to seeing this clay differently, or from seeing this clay to, or from not seeing certain features of it to seeing those features. And the ability to do that has everything to do with skill acquisition. But we say skill, but what is a skill? A skill is in part acquiring a suite of what is salient, of what matters. So you can't, I guess, maybe one way to put it, and this is related to the question of care versus attention, is I'm trying to suggest that we can't really have a value-free vocabulary for thinking about the way in which we work to try to get to know the things around us. But the whole point of my remark at the end about we're an aesthetic predicament to ourselves is that these questions are not simple yes/no questions. And I think, you know, the cognitive scientist says, do you see the tomato or don't you see the tomato? Are you aware of the detail in the room in front of you, or are you not aware of the detail in the room in front of you? You know, when I look at Sarah, am I aware of the chairs behind her, or am I not? The minute you ask those questions, you realize that it's if we stand before an aesthetic problem of trying to attune ourselves to what is there, and that is partly an educational thing.
I apologize to the members of the audience who would like to ask questions, but we are already 5 minutes past the limit. So let's thank Alva once more.
Thank you. Thank you.